This story belongs to me. My daughter walked out of our home one ordinary morning, carrying her briefcase, her travel mug of coffee, and the promise she'd be back in time for supper. She was 24, brilliant and kind, with a clear sense of her place in the world. I saw her car pull away down our long gravel drive, having no idea it was the final time I would ever see her face in person. The days stretched into months. Hope became a painful habit. Then, 35 years later, the evening news revealed a truth I had never wanted. It was April 3rd, 1989, a dull Tuesday in Ohio. It was the kind of morning where the clouds seemed to press down on the world, yet life carried on as it always did. My daughter, Anna, was awake before the sun, as was her way. She had her mother's sense of discipline and my own brand of stubbornness. She poured her coffee, slipped on her shoes, and gave her mother a kiss on the cheek by the stove. I can still recall the smell of toast, the low murmur of a news program on the radio, and the way she smiled when I reminded her to drive carefully. She just laughed, promised she'd be home for dinner, and that was all. The door clicked shut, her car's engine started with a familiar hum, and the sound slowly disappeared down the road, which was lined with the skeletal branches of trees yet to bloom. She had been working as a paralegal at a downtown law firm for nearly 3 years, saving up for a small apartment of her own. She was never reckless, not the type to suddenly run away or seek out trouble. She found comfort in her routines. The same breakfast, the same commute, the same time she would pull into the driveway every evening. There was no conceivable reason to believe this day would be any different. Her mother waved from the porch until the little sedan vanished over the crest of the hill. She turned to me, her expression soft, and said, "She's growing up so quickly." I smiled back at her. "She's still our girl," I replied. But as the day wore on, something about it felt wrong. The air seemed to grow heavier, the silence in the house more profound. Around midday, a cold, persistent drizzle began to fall from the sky, a rain that felt as if it might never end. I spent most of the afternoon in the garage, tinkering with an old lawnmower, glancing at my watch with increasing frequency. By 5 o'clock, I was peering out the living room window, expecting to see her headlights at any moment. 6 o'clock came, and then 7. The rain had ceased, but a knot of worry had begun to form in my stomach. By 8, her mother was pacing the floor. She telephoned the firm, and the security guard delivered the words every parent is terrified to hear. She'd signed out at her usual time. No one had seen her after that. Her desk, mate said she'd mentioned she was heading directly home. That was the extent of it. No disagreements, no odd behavior, nothing out of the ordinary. She was simply gone. I tried to soothe my wife's fears. I suggested her car might have broken down, or that she'd stopped to help another motorist on the side of the road. But as midnight arrived and the house remained steeped in an unnatural quiet, I knew something was terribly wrong. The very atmosphere felt altered, colder, and more menacing. Her mother made a pot of coffee, though neither of us touched it. Every small sound from outside, a twig snapping under the weight of an animal, a distant car on the main road, caused her to jump. At 2 in the morning, I pulled on my coat and announced I was going to drive her route myself. I retraced every mile of road between our home and her office building. I pulled into every all-night gas station, circled the parking lots of every closed diner, and scanned every roadside ditch my headlights could find. The road was deserted. It felt unnaturally empty. When I returned home, just as the sky was beginning to pale, she was still sitting in the same chair by the window, the same lamp casting a lonely glow, her hands trembling around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. I didn't need to speak. She read the truth in my face. That morning marked the dividing line in our lives, the chasm between before and after. Before, our home was filled with laughter, with discussions of upcoming holidays, with hope for what was to come. After, there was only the waiting. Her shoes remained by the door. Her favorite coat stayed on its hook, and her place at the dinner table was left empty. The warmth seemed to have been permanently drained from the air within our home. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the day that, for us, time simply stopped. The clocks on the wall continued to tick, the pages of the calendar continued to turn, but we were no longer moving forward. Every sunrise looked identical. Just one more day, she had not come home. By the following morning, a sense of controlled panic had set in. Her mother hadn't slept. Her eyes were swollen and red, and her voice was hoarse from whispering prayers into the darkness. I told her I would go out once more, drive the route again, ask more questions, knock on more doors. The sun was just breaking the horizon as I backed out of the driveway, taking the same path Anna had taken the day before. Every mile was familiar, yet it all looked alien to me now. I found myself scrutinizing tire tracks in the soft mud on the shoulder, trying to determine if any of them could have been hers. The drive from our house to the law firm was a straight shot down Highway 32, a 30-minute journey past sprawling farmland and an old service station near the turnpike entrance. I made my first stop there. The attendant on duty said he hadn't seen anyone matching my daughter's description. I purchased a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and left it on the counter, my hands shaking too badly to hold it. At her office, the parking garage was already filling up with professionals in suits. I saw a few of her colleagues, young women she'd mentioned, now with serious expressions and weary eyes. They saw me approach, and their conversation died. I didn't need to explain why I was there. Did she say anything unusual before she left yesterday? I asked, my voice strained. They all shook their heads. One confirmed she had left around 4 o'clock, same as always, saying she was going home. Another recalled seeing her walk towards the elevator, humming softly to herself. After that, nothing. No arguments, no encounters with strangers, no sign of any trouble. It was just another mundane workday that had concluded in something uniquely cruel. I searched the garage for her car, but it was gone. It was as if it had been erased from existence. I spent the rest of the day driving down back roads, stopping at every diner and convenience store, asking every person I encountered if they had seen a small, blue sedan with an Ohio license plate. Some offered a shrug, others a word of sympathy, but no one had any answers. By late afternoon, I called the police. The officer who took my call sounded detached, almost bored. He explained that it wasn't uncommon for adults to take off for a few days and suggested I should wait. I insisted that my daughter wasn't like that. She was responsible. She didn't have any secret debts or hidden troubles. The man on the other end of the line simply sighed. "Let's give another day or two," he said. A day or two. It felt like he was telling me to hold my breath indefinitely. That night, I drove the same highway again. My headlights sliced through the darkness, like searching hands grasping for something that simply wasn't there. I would pull over every few miles and just listen, straining to hear the sound of her car's engine in the distance. At times, I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the fields, but when I got out of my car, it was only the wind rustling through the corn stalks. At midnight, I drove directly to the police station. My hands are trembling as I filled out the official missing person report. I wrote down every detail I could conjure: her height, her weight, the small scar above her eyebrow, what she had been wearing, the melodic sound of her voice, even the specific way she walked. The officer transcribed it all with a slow, methodical pace, as if it were just another piece of paperwork and not the documentation of shattered world. Her mother remained at home, sitting by the window. She wouldn't go to bed, insisting that she had to keep the porch light on in case Anna came home. That light would remain on for the next 15 years. When I returned that night, I didn't have to tell her there was no news. The despair on my face was enough. She finally broke down then, not with a loud cry, but with a soft, hollow sound, as if something fundamental inside her had fractured. I held her, but I was breaking apart too. That was the longest night of my life. Every minute felt like an hour. Every noise from outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I sat by the telephone, waiting for it to ring with news that never came. When the sun finally rose, I understood what I had suspected all along. Something terrible had occurred, and simply waiting was not going to bring her back. The weeks that followed were a disorienting mix of frantic activity and profound silence, the kind of days that merge into one another until you lose track of time. The police initiated their investigation in a standard, procedural manner: questions, maps, and official statements. They dispatched 2 detectives to the law firm, reviewed security logs, interviewed her coworkers, and walked the perimeter of the building as if the concrete itself might offer up a clue. They discovered nothing. Not a single scuff mark, not a trace of her car. It was as though the road had opened up and swallowed my daughter whole. We printed stacks of flyers bearing her photograph. A picture of a smiling young woman in a crisp blouse, her hair neatly styled, her eyes filled with a light the world had not yet extinguished. We posted them on every telephone pole, taped them to the walls of every diner, and left them on the counters of every gas station from Ohio to Indiana. People promised they would keep an eye out. Some accepted the flyers with genuine concern. Others averted their gaze. The sympathy of strangers is a fleeting thing when the missing person is not one of their own. Local television crews showed up for a couple of days. They filmed us standing on our front porch, my wife clutching one of Anna's sweaters as if it were a sacred relic. On the evening news, the anchor referred to it as a mysterious disappearance. Then, just as quickly as they had arrived, they were gone. Other, more sensational stories emerged, and ours was soon buried beneath them. The police divers searched the local river 3 separate times. They found nothing. They checked area hospitals, morgues, and highway rest stops. Nothing. Every potential lead evaporated into thin air. Some nights, the phone would ring, and a stranger would claim to have seen her in a different city, a different state. I would drive for hours, fueled by a desperate hope, only to find someone who merely bore a passing resemblance. Each time, my heart would soar for a moment before crashing back to earth. The seasons changed, but inside our house, time remained frozen. Her bedroom was left exactly as she had left it. Her shoes were still under the bed. A book lay open on her nightstand. A half-folded sweater sat on a chair, waiting for a person who would never return. Her mother refused to wash her pillowcase, claiming she could still smell the faint scent of her shampoo. She would speak to her every night in a soft whisper, as if Anna were in the next room and could hear her. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but every task felt meaningless. The world outside our home continued on its axis. The mail was delivered, our neighbors went about their lives, but we were trapped in a state of suspended animation. Every knock at the door made my pulse quicken. Every ring of the telephone felt as if it carried the immense weight of our future. But the door was always open to someone else. The phone calls were never the one we were waiting for. As the months passed, the police called less frequently. Their voices became more distant, their words rehearsed, as if they were reading from a script they reserve for families like ours. "We're still investigating," they would say, but their tone told a different story. They were not. By the time Christmas arrived, even the flyers we had posted looked weary and defeated. The rain had caused her face to blur on the paper. The ink had faded, and the corners had curled. Her mother decorated the tree anyway, hanging the ornaments Anna had made as a child, whispering a prayer with each one. I tried to share in her belief. I told her Anna would come back, that any day now she would walk through that door, smiling as if nothing had ever happened. But deep down, I had already begun to mourn a person who was, for all I knew, still alive. Years later, I would realize that was the most brutal part of it all, the not knowing. Death brings with it a certain finality. A disappearance is a wound that is never allowed to heal. Every morning you wake up and wonder if this will be the day you finally give up hope, but you never do. Hope doesn't vanish. It just learns to be quiet. A detective came by one spring afternoon with a small box of her things. They had been found in an abandoned locker at a bus station 2 states away. Inside were a few paperback novels, a scarf I didn't recognize, and a photograph of her standing with a friend. There were no answers, only more painful reminders of what we had lost. After that, the official search dwindled to nothing. The police closed her case. They labeled it inactive, but for us, it was a death sentence delivered without a body. Her mother never forgave herself for not trying to stop her from leaving that morning. She was convinced that if she had just told her to stay home, it would have changed everything. I told her not to torture herself with such thoughts, but I had them too, every single day. That is how the years began to pass, not with closure, but with an endless, agonizing wait. Waiting became our new way of life. The months after the official search concluded felt like living in a faded photograph. Everything appeared the same, but the life had been drained out of it. The house that had once been filled with voices and movement became a hollow space, filled only by silence. Her mother stopped finding joy in cooking. She would stand at the kitchen counter, a mixing bowl in her hands, and then just freeze, staring out the window as if the world beyond it had stolen something she couldn't articulate. I tried to keep our lives in motion. I repaired the fence, mowed the lawn, went to my job, but it all felt like a mechanical performance. I was maintaining a house that no longer felt like a home. Every object, every photograph, every coat hanging by the door seemed to be waiting for her return. We both were. We waited in our own ways. She waited with a fragile, unwavering hope. I waited with a heavy, suffocating guilt. For the first year, she continued to set a place for Anna at the dinner table. Every evening, there were 3 plates instead of 2. She said it made her feel as though she wasn't truly gone. I never argued. I would just watch as she spoke to the empty chair, whispering small things like, "You must be exhausted," or "The soup is your favorite." It broke a piece of my soul every time, but I couldn't bring myself to stop her. Love can make us do desperate, irrational things. Our neighbors gradually stopped visiting. In the beginning, they came by often with casseroles and comforting words, urging us not to give up. But as the weeks stretched into months, their visits became less frequent. People grow uneasy around a grief that has no end. Eventually, they would just offer a brief wave from their cars, a silent acknowledgement of our private tragedy. I couldn't hold it against them. The silence of our house was a burden too heavy for anyone but us to carry. Her mother began sleeping in Anna's room. She said she felt closer to her in there. I found her one night, sitting on the floor, holding one of Anna's shoes, rocking back and forth, and murmuring something I couldn't understand. When I tried to help her up, she looked at me with haunted eyes and said, "Don't change anything. She might come back and think we've forgotten her." That statement wounded me more than any angry words ever could. I stopped talking much after that. Words seemed hollow and useless. What could I possibly say that didn't feel like a lie? Every conversation we had eventually circled back to the same question from her. "Do you think she's still alive?" And I would always give the same answer. "I hope so," even on the days when I didn't. I started sleeping on the sofa in the living room. Our bed felt too vast. The air in the room too thick with unspoken sorrow. The house seemed to age more rapidly than we did. The paint began to peel, the floorboards creaked with a mournful sound, and the windows always seemed to be fogged over, as if the house itself were sighing. Then came the anniversaries. The first year, the second. We would mark them by lighting a candle and looking through old photo albums. After the 5th year, she stopped acknowledging the date. I understood. There are only so many times you can force yourself to relive the worst day of your life before it becomes an act of self-destruction. I remember one evening, perhaps in the 6th year, she sat next to me on the porch and quietly said, "Maybe we should move," but by the next morning, she had taken it back. "If we move," she said, her voice trembling, "how will she ever find her way home?" And so we remained, caught in an endless cycle of waiting. Her health started to decline. Not suddenly, but like a candle slowly burning down. The doctor called it stress. I knew it was a broken heart. She smiled less, spoke less, and, eventually, she stopped opening the curtains. The sunlight seemed to hurt her eyes. By the time the 10th anniversary arrived, we were like 2 ghosts haunting a house filled with memories. The laughter, the celebrations, the simple noise of life had all been replaced by the low, constant hum of grief. There were no more arguments, no flashes of anger, just a silence so dense that even the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like an accusation. The world moved on. Our town forgot, but we didn't. We couldn't. Her mother used to say, "She'll walk through that door one day," and I would nod, even though in the darkest corners of my mind, I had already buried her 100 times over. Time does not heal when there is no truth to cling to. It only sands down the sharp edges of the pain until you can no longer remember what it felt like to be whole. The years after my daughter disappeared were long and empty, like living in a tunnel with no light at the end. After my wife passed away, the house became too quiet to endure. Every room was populated by ghosts. One day, I packed a single bag, walked out, and didn't bother to lock the door. There was nothing left inside worth protecting. I began to drift across the country, the way people do when they no longer have a place to belong. I took on odd jobs in small, forgotten towns, repairing fences, painting barns, anything to keep my hands occupied and my mind from wandering. I slept in cheap motels that smelled of stale smoke and disinfectant, where the only sound at night was the low hum of an ice machine down the hall. Every face I saw in a crowd became a potential ghost. Sometimes I'd see a woman with the same posture or the same way of walking, and my heart would seize in my chest. I would stare for too long, hoping for a flicker of recognition. It was never her. I learned that hope can become a destructive habit, one you can't break even when it's poisoning you. Every new town held the possibility of a new rumor. A woman matching her description was working as a waitress in Oregon. There was a librarian in Montana who had lost her memory. A truck driver in Texas swore he had given a ride to a quiet woman who looked just like her picture. I pursued them all, driving thousands of miles across the country in pursuit of shadows. I would arrive, find nothing but a dead end, and move on to the next town. Hope is a cruel companion. It keeps you alive only to wound you again. I kept a small, worn notebook in my coat pocket. It was filled with scribbled names of towns, dates, and fragments of conversations with people who thought they might have seen her. It became my personal map of disappointment. I told myself that if I just kept moving, one day I might walk into the right place at the right time. But the truth was, I wasn't really searching for her anymore. I was searching for the part of myself that had vanished with her. There were nights I would stop at lonely diners, sit in a booth by myself, and imagine she was sitting across from me, sipping her tea the way she used to. I would have entire conversations with her in my head, asking her where she had gone, what she had seen, why she had never called. The answers never came, of course, but it made the silence more bearable. As the years bled into decades, I learned to exist without expectation. I learned to breathe without waiting for the phone to ring, to drive without scanning every face on the sidewalk. I learned how to carry my grief quietly, like a folded note in my pocket, always there but not always visible. In Wyoming, I worked on a ranch for 5 years. The owner never asked about my past, and I never offered it. We would watch the sun rise over the mountains every morning, and for a short time, I found a measure of peace in the vast, silent landscape. I almost convinced myself that letting go was the same as healing. But I never really stopped searching. I just became better at hiding it. Some part of me was always scanning every crowd, every newspaper headline, every passing car. Every woman who looked to be about her age, now older, with lines around her eyes, would make my chest tighten. I would try to imagine what 30 years would have done to her face. Would she still have that small dimple when she smiled? Would her hair have streaks of gray like mine? The hardest part was not the missing her. It was the ambiguity. Grief has a finality. Hope is a restless thing that never lets you sleep. I grew old without noticing it. My hands developed a slight tremor. My walk became slower. But my heart never stopped holding on to that one relentless question. Where are you, Anna? By the time I settled in a small trailer outside of Tucson, I was exhausted. Not from living, but from searching. The road had offered me nothing but silence, and I had finally learned to accept it. I believed my story was over, that my daughter had simply vanished into a corner of the world where a father's love could not find her. I had no idea that life was waiting to prove me wrong in the most brutal and unexpected way imaginable. The years had melted into one another, like wax from a candle that was never extinguished. I no longer marked time with calendars or birthdays. I measured it by the slow, steady quieting of my world. The phone rang less often. The few friends who had promised to stay in touch eventually drifted away. Even my own voice began to sound strange to me when I spoke it aloud after days of silence. The only constant sound was the wind whistling around the corners of my trailer, a lonely sound that refused to let me forget. My wife had been gone for over 20 years by then, buried beneath an old oak tree in the cemetery back in Ohio. I never returned for the funeral. I couldn't bear the thought of standing over her grave while knowing our daughter might still be alive somewhere. She had died still believing that Anna would walk through the door one day, smiling that same bright smile. Perhaps that belief gave her some comfort in her final moments. Or perhaps it was the thing that ultimately broke her. I will never know. I filled the oppressive silence with routine. Coffee at 6, the news at 7, a slow walk to the mailbox, which was invariably empty. I would sit on my porch steps under the relentless Arizona sun, staring at the horizon until my vision blurred. I thought about her less, or perhaps I just thought about her differently. The sharp, stabbing pain of her absence had dulled into a chronic, quiet ache, like an old injury you can press on but no longer feel acutely. Still, some nights, the old grief would return in dreams. It was always the same one. I would see her walking down our old gravel road, her little blue car parked behind her. She would raise her hand to wave, and I would wake up just before she reached the porch. Every single time. I had a simple story I told the few neighbors who asked about my past. I would say I had a daughter once, a long time ago, who worked in law and loved to read, and that she had moved away somewhere up north. It was easier than telling the truth. People don't know how to react when you tell them you lost your child not to death, but to silence. Sometimes I would drive into town and sit at a diner by the highway. It was the kind of place filled with truckers and tourists, people in transit. I'd sit by the window with a cup of black coffee and just watch the cars go by. I think a small part of me still believed that one day she might walk through that door, older, grayer, maybe with a story of how she'd gotten lost and had finally found her way back. That kind of foolish hope is the last thing to die in a person. I learned to live with the unanswered question like it was a quiet roommate, always present, always just out of reach. And then, one ordinary morning, everything changed. It was just like any other day. The taste of coffee, the creak of my chair, the familiar flicker of the television screen. But the image that appeared next made my blood run cold. Because after 35 years of silence, the face on the news was not a stranger's. It was my daughter's, older, harder, but it was her. It was an unremarkable morning, the kind that blends into the next, where the air is thick with the mundane. I had the television on in the background, the volume low, just a murmur to fill the empty space. I wasn't paying attention. It was just noise to keep the silence at bay. My coffee had grown cold in my hands when a headline crawled across the bottom of the screen in stark, white letters. Federal contractor arrested in Nevada, identity fraud case. Something about the words made me look up. And then I saw the photograph. For a long moment, I simply forgot how to breathe. The image was grainy, as still from a news conference. A woman was being led out of a courthouse in handcuffs, surrounded by a swarm of reporters and flashing cameras. Her hair was graying at the temples, her face etched with lines I didn't recognize. But I knew those eyes. I knew the determined set of her jaw. I knew the way her mouth tightened when she was trying to conceal her emotions. It was her. It was Anna, the daughter I had mourned 1,000 times over in my mind. The coffee mug slipped from my grasp and shattered on the linoleum floor, but I barely registered the sound. My heart was pounding so violently I could feel the pulse in my ears. The reporter's voice seemed to come from a great distance, but I caught fragments of what she was saying. Lived under a false name for more than 3 decades, multiple passports, federal investigation, marriage records in 2 states. Each word was like a physical blow. I stared at the screen, waiting for a correction, for someone to say it was all a terrible mistake. But there was no correction. Her name, or at least the name she had been using, flashed on the screen. And beneath it, in smaller text, were the words, "Born in Ohio, missing since 1989. That was the confirmation. The air rushed out of my lungs. It was like watching a ghost rise from its grave and calmly introduce itself to the world. I leaned forward, my body trembling, and traced the outline of her face on the screen with my finger. She looked well. Older, certainly, but strong. It was the kind of strength that comes from a life that has been lived, not one that was lost. But there was something else in her expression, a coldness, a distance. The girl I had raised had kindness in her eyes. This woman had walls. The newscaster continued her report in a steady, clinical tone. Neighbors describe her as quiet, disciplined, a woman who kept to herself. She worked for a government agency under an assumed identity. Married twice, divorced twice, no known children, married twice. No children. A woman with no discernible past, no connection to her family. My throat constricted. All those years, I had clung to the idea that she was out there somewhere, that perhaps she had lost her memory and couldn't find her way back. All of those desperate hopes were obliterated in a single sentence. She hadn't been lost. She had chosen to be gone. She had constructed an entirely new life while I had spent mine sifting through the ruins of our old one. I switched off the television, but the silence that followed was deafening. The emotion that filled me wasn't relief. It was a chaotic storm of confusion, disbelief, and a darker feeling I didn't want to name. I went outside and sat on the trailer steps, staring up at the vast, indifferent sky as if it held the answers. For 35 years, I had asked where she had gone. Now I knew, but the knowing was infinitely more painful than the not knowing had ever been. For hours, I just sat there, feeling the desert heat on my skin. I thought about the young woman who had driven away from our house in 1989, her future bright and full of promise, and a stranger on the television screen with handcuffs on her wrists. Somewhere between those two images, the daughter I had raised had vanished, not into death, but into someone else's name. I turned the TV back on later that night, desperate for more information. They replayed the same clip. This time, I saw it, the briefest flicker of her eyes as she looked up at the cameras. For a split second, it felt as though she was looking directly at me, as if she knew, as if she had always known I would still be watching. And that's when I finally understood. She had not disappeared by accident. She had walked away from us, from her entire life, to become someone new. And now, the world knew her again, just not as my daughter. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed the news clip in my mind, over and over, each frame a fresh wound. 35 years of wondering had not ended with peace, but with a more profound kind of torment. The realization that my daughter hadn't been taken or lost or harmed, but had chosen to disappear, that she had erased us, settled in my bones. I sat in my old armchair, staring at the blank television screen long after the broadcast had ended, the static hissing like whispers from the past. The next morning, I turned on the radio, hoping for more details. A calm, professional voice confirmed what I already knew. Authorities have confirmed the suspect lived under multiple aliases since 1990. Known in her community as Catherine Dale, she was a private contractor for a federal agency. The words felt like they were from a novel, not my life. Catherine Dale, my Anna, who had once signed her name in looping, girlish script on her schoolwork, now had a stranger's name, a stranger's life. I sat at my small kitchen table, trying to piece it all together. Every theory I had constructed over the decades, abduction, amnesia, a tragic accident, crumbled into dust. She had walked away of her own free will, and in doing so, she had created a world in which I did not exist. The news anchor mentioned she had been living in Nevada for most of those years, working under a government contract, traveling extensively and blending in seamlessly. The neighbors described her as polite but distant. She never talked much about her past, one woman said. She told us her family had died in a car crash years ago. That sentence broke what was left of my heart. She had told people we were dead. I thought of her mother, of how she had gone to her grave, still praying for Anna's return. She had kept Anna's favorite cake recipe in a kitchen drawer, and every April, on her birthday, she would bake one and place a single candle on top. For 35 years, she had whispered her daughter's name every night before she went to sleep, and all that time, Anna was alive, pretending we had never existed. I walked outside and looked up at the bright, cruel Arizona sky. I asked aloud to no one why. Maybe she had felt suffocated. Maybe she craved a freedom I couldn't understand. Maybe she wanted to be someone other than who she was. I could have forgiven almost anything. A crime, a secret, even just running away. But this was different. She hadn't just left. She had rewritten her own history. She had edited us out of her life story. The more I considered it, the clearer the picture became. She must have left that morning in 1989 with a plan already in motion. The job, the routine, it was all a cover. Maybe she had been planning her escape for months. A new identity, a new state, a new name. I remembered the spy novel she used to read, stories about secret agents, and starting over. Maybe she believed a new life would make her invincible. The news reports continued for a few days. They called it identity fraud, but it felt like something far more profound. A theft of truth. She'd had 2 marriages, both under her false name. No children. No trace of the girl who once sat at our kitchen table, laughing as she promised she would take care of us when we got old. That promise now echoed in my mind, a bitter, hollow sound. I found myself pacing the floor of my small trailer, torn between a cold, hard anger and a twisted sense of pride. Anger that she had erased me, and pride that, against all odds, she had survived. Somehow, both feelings existed at once. The most difficult truth wasn't that she was alive. It was that she had never wanted to be found. The girl who once held my hand tightly in crowded places had become a woman who hid her own name from the world, and perhaps even from herself. For 3 days after seeing her on the news, I existed in a fog, half dream, half nightmare. I didn't eat. I didn't answer the phone when it rang. I just sat, listening to the desert wind scrape against the tin walls of the trailer, a sound like time itself refusing to let me rest. I had to see her. I had to hear her voice, to look in her eyes, and ask her why. I didn't care if she screamed at me, if she denied knowing me. I just needed to know that somewhere inside that stranger, my daughter still existed. So I called the sheriff's office in Nevada. My voice trembled when I spoke her real name, the name I had whispered to myself for 35 years. The officer on the other end of the line paused, asked me to state my relationship to her, and then told me to hold. I waited, my hand gripping the receiver so tightly my knuckles were white. When he returned to the line, his tone was different, softer, more cautious. "Sir," he began, "she does not wish to speak with anyone from her past." Those words landed with the force of a physical blow. My heart plummeted. I pleaded with him, my voice cracking, explaining who I was, that I was her father, that her mother had died waiting for her. I said I only wanted 5 minutes, that I wouldn't ask questions, that I wouldn't judge. The line was silent for a long moment. Then the officer sighed. "I'm sorry, sir. She says her family passed away years ago. She says there has been a mistake." That sentence hollowed me out completely. For decades, I had prayed for her to be alive, safe, and happy. And now I had my answer. But I had never imagined it would be delivered as a rejection. I wasn't just forgotten. I had been deliberately erased. I hung up the phone without saying another word. My hand was shaking as I placed the receiver back in its cradle. I felt as if I were standing in the rubble of something I had spent my entire life trying to protect. The truth wasn't that my daughter had died. It was that she had buried us herself. That night, I pulled an old cardboard box out from under my bed. It was filled with her childhood, crayon drawings, school report cards, a birthday card she had made for me that read, "To the best dad in the world." Her handwriting was clumsy and uneven. I traced the letters with my finger until they blurred through my tears. How could the little girl who wrote those words grow into a woman who would pretend I never existed? I sat on my porch until sunrise, watching the light slowly creep across the desert. For the first time in my life, I felt truly old. Not in my bones, but in my soul. The years of searching, the nights of prayer, the thousands of miles I had traveled, they all collapsed into one simple truth: she did not want to be found. Over the next few weeks, I wrote her letters, dozens of them. I sent them to the federal facility where she was being held. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I forgave her, even though I didn't understand. I told her I would always call her my daughter, even if she called me nothing at all. None of the letters were ever returned to me, but I never received a reply. The news cycle moved on, as it always does. Her story vanished from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. But I couldn't move on. The last I heard, She had been released pending further investigation. Then, just as she had before, she disappeared. Except this time, it wasn't a mystery. It was a choice. The daughter I had mourned for 35 years was alive. And yet, in every way that truly mattered, she was still gone. I used to believe the cruelest thing a person could endure was loss. I know now that it's not losing someone that destroys you. It's the realization that they chose to leave. My daughter left for work one morning, and in my heart, I buried her that same night. For 35 years, I carried her memory like an open wound, only to discover that while I was grieving, she was living, breathing, and even laughing somewhere else under another name, another life. There is no word for that kind of grief. It isn't death, and it isn't life. It's a ghost that takes up residence inside you and refuses to leave. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what I would say if I ever saw her again. I wouldn't ask her where she had been or why she had left. I would just tell her that her mother never, for one single day, stopped loving her. That she kept Anna's picture on her bedside table until the very end. I'd tell her that every decision I made, every road I took after she was gone, was shaped by the hollow space she left behind. And maybe then, just for a moment, she would understand the true cost of her silence. There are mornings when I wake up, and for a few blissful seconds, I forget that she's alive. I believe the story I told myself for all those years, that she was taken, that she didn't have a choice. But then the truth comes rushing back. She didn't want to be found. And that knowledge is heavier than any tombstone. I don't think I blame her anymore. Maybe she was running from something I could never comprehend, from the expectations of a small town, from the kind of life that felt too small for her dreams. Maybe she always intended to come back, but time has a way of turning distance into an impassable gulf. 1 year became 5, then 10, then 35. By then, perhaps it was easier to pretend we were dead than to face the wreckage she had left behind. I will never know her reasons, and that is the part that will follow me to my grave. Sometimes I still talk to her, not to the woman on the news, but to the girl I raised, the one who rode her bicycle down our street, who laughed too loudly at her mother's jokes, who used to fall asleep on the couch with her shoes still on. That version of her still exists, not out in the world, but inside of me. And maybe that has to be enough. People say that time heals all wounds. It doesn't. It just teaches you how to live with the pain. It teaches you how to smile at a stranger while carrying a graveyard inside your chest. It teaches you that love doesn't end. It just changes its shape. It becomes something quieter, something only you can hear. If she's still out there, maybe she will hear this story one day. Maybe she will recognize my voice, the same one that used to call her in for dinner. And maybe, just maybe, she will understand what 35 years of silence truly cost. She vanished once as my daughter and reappeared as a stranger. But even strangers carry the shadows of who they used to be. And even now, after everything, if she ever knocked on my door, I would open it.